let's jump into this conversation around weaponization and how DEI, we may feel like sometimes we're on our heels or where we should be. What's your experience? In our first question, what's your experience as a practitioner with the so-called anti-woke attacks and caricatures of DEI?
Yeah, it's a great question to start with. Of course, like many people, I've seen the headlines, I've seen the news. I've even encountered, conversations with people who have been reading the same headlines and consuming, let's say, news articles from a particular political bent, caricaturizing DEI as this sort of anti-woke attack, trying to brainwash people, trying to punish white people for being born white, and all sorts of things that I'm not going to give the validity of saying out loud. Um, and I spend a lot of time working with organizations, specifically doing DEI assessments. And so, in those contexts, I'm interviewing folks, doing focus groups, collecting quantitative and qualitative data. And I actually see some of these concerns pop up as well there. And those
Mhm.
concerns are a little more interesting than just, the Wall Street Journal put out another misleading headline that's going to tick a bunch of people off. I'm seeing a lot of people exhibit fear and anxiety around DEI. And I think there's something there because
Mhm.
when people are scared that they might lose their jobs, scared that their families might not have the resources they need to survive, scared that their kids aren't getting the education that they need to succeed in the world, they're vulnerable. And when people are vulnerable, and let's say there are other powerful groups with maybe not the best of intentions to take advantage of that, that's the perfect conditions for this kind of misinformation around DEI to spread. And what I try to do as a practitioner is to not validate their conclusions, which in my mind are very clearly biased and incorrect. I'm not going to validate that DEI is trying to brainwash people because it's clearly not. But I will validate that they came to that conclusion, or they were perhaps maliciously guided to that conclusion because they're scared, because they're anxious, because they're not sure about their own career prospects or their workplace success or the well-being of their families and communities and loved ones. And as a result, they're grasping onto any answer that can give them some clarity, even if it's the wrong answer. So I see that quite a bit. What I view as my job is to validate the underlying emotion, which is, of course, people's emotions are always valid, even if their conclusions are not things that are particularly rooted in reality, and go from there and offer them alternatives to say, you know what, I hear you. I hear that you're anxious. I hear that you're scared. There's a lot of things changing. And I too am worried that the world is changing faster than I can keep up with it. And in some ways, I miss 2010, right? Like things felt easier in 2010 or 2005 or whenever, right? Before we had all of these conversations. But in many ways, the fact that we're talking about inequity, white supremacy, toxic masculinity, right? These things now is a signal that as a society, we are becoming more able to do the work. We're becoming more able to not just acknowledge problems and inequities and injustices, but fix them together. And that might feel scary, especially if that's not something you've ever done before. But I try to offer people a role in the world that we're trying to build. Chuck, actually, it was the white men's leadership study all those years ago, right, that I stumbled across and read and really took a lot away from, because one of the big
Mhm.
findings of that study was that the vast majority of white male leaders didn't see a role for themselves in DEI work. And that was one of the biggest reasons why they didn't participate. That really moved me. And I realized
Mhm.
that there's a lot of people who might be neutral or maybe even slightly positive towards DEI who don't see themselves in the future that practitioners are describing. And as a result, they very understandably double down on their defensiveness. They get scared, they act out of fear and anxiety, and they become, unfortunately, easy pickings for bad actors that are, looking to capitalize on that fear and anxiety.